tonight's event, we're really excited to be joined by Vicky Spratt discussing her new book, Tenants, about the housing crisis in Britain and the renters that it affects. Vicky is a journalist whose work regularly shapes public policy. Her 2016 campaign, Make Renting Fair, led to letting fees in England and Wales being banned, and she's spoken at political conferences, all-party parliamentary groups, and panels across the country on the issue of housing. She's currently the iPaper's housing correspondent and a writer and editor at Refinery 29. Vicky's in conversation with Nick Bano and Natalie Ola. Nick is a tenants' rights lawyer and campaigner. He writes regularly about the housing crisis for Tribune and other publications, and he's currently writing a book. Natalie is the author of Steal As Much As You Can. Her writing focuses on the intersections between politics and contemporary culture, particularly focusing on marginalized and working class communities. And her next book is coming out next year, which is really exciting. And in the meantime, we're just super grateful that they've both joined us for this evening's event. If you'd like to ask our speakers a question, you can write it in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. You can ask questions anonymously if you would like to. You can upvote other questions if you want to see any answered in particular. We'll keep an eye on the chat and the Q&A throughout the event, and I will be here to look after any technical issues that we might have. But thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to hand over to our speakers now, and I hope you enjoy.
Thanks very much, Alice. I'm going to start, and first of all, congratulations to Vicky on the book. It's a really great book, and we know that because everyone up to and including the Times has reviewed it favourably, and it's great to have such a specialist author write in such an accessible way. And I wanted to start with the title of the book, because you sort of buck the trend of talking about a housing crisis by talking about a housing emergency. And you quote Engels in the book, who sort of argues, well, there's always a housing crisis under capitalism. So there's never really much sense in talking about a housing crisis. And I just wondered if you could tell us what you think the terms emergency and crisis mean, whether you think it makes sense at all to talk about a crisis and why you've chosen emergency instead.
It's a really great question. And thank you so much. I think my issue with the term housing crisis is twofold. So firstly, a crisis implies something that can't be foreseen, that might happen overnight, like an earthquake or a natural disaster, and then you're in a crisis. But that's not what this is. This has been happening over really, I think, 3 decades now, although obviously there are housing issues that predate that. But in the book, I talk about how the housing problems that we're experiencing right now really do date back to the 1980s, and they date back to Thatcher. So since then, house prices have been going up, rents have been getting more expensive, renters' rights have been diminished, social housing has been in decline. So to say that we woke up one day and had a housing crisis is completely inaccurate. And I think for politicians to use that term as well lets them off the hook, and it sort of glosses over the ways that political policies have created this complete clusterfuck that we are now in, where I think it's 1 in 3 people, according to Shelter, are impacted by the housing emergency. We'll get on to emergency in a second, but by that I mean unaffordable, unstable, insecure housing, a lack of access to safe and secure homes. And emergency, I don't think housing emergency is a perfect phrase, but I think it does more work than housing crisis. So that is what was settled on. And it conveys what this is, I think, which is a social and economic emergency that is really hurting people right now, impacting their lives right now. And it was completely avoidable and completely predictable. And particularly since around 2010, politicians have been reluctant to do anything about it. And certainly during the Cameron Osborne years, as I understand it, the term housing crisis was banned in Whitehall. So not only were they reluctant to legislate in a way that would actually help renters, they were just not letting people talk about it, even policymakers and civil servants. So I hope housing emergency goes some way towards conveying how serious this is in a way that crisis doesn't. But I don't think it's perfect. We hear about the climate emergency all the time, but we also know that people do eventually switch off when they keep hearing emergency, emergency, emergency over again. But this isn't a particularly literary answer. ultimately you have to settle on a subtitle for a book. And there was much discussion at my publisher as to what the subtitle for this book would be. We didn't always agree. This was the one I hated the least.
Well, that's a great answer. I think it's really interesting how that point you made about government vernacular has changed. And we saw about 10 years ago now, when Raquel Rolnick visited the UK and criticised the government, she was dismissed as like a Marxist in racist and misogynistic terms. And then a few years later, that understanding starts to crystallise in government. And then the renting white paper described Britain's broken housing market, which is exactly what she'd been saying all along. And I think there came a point at which it was inevitable. Natalie, I don't know if you wanted to come in on that or move onwards.
Yes, I was going to say, actually, when we were talking about the terminology around the housing crisis, and I think part of that as well is that the terminology is sort of dreamt up by policymakers and their PR people about how we're going to address this issue and how we're going to kind of shape it in the public imagination. One of the things that I am concerned about and write about is the sort of like threshold to people being able to be heard and to have a voice in our society. And housing is no less a space in which that is an issue, in that oftentimes the people who bear the brunt of a lot of the policy making that happens in this country are also excluded from the kind of halls of power and influence that enable those issues to be put on the table and to be discussed, whether that's in like politics or whether it's in the media. And one of the things I really liked about your book was the kind of journalistic emphasis and the deliberate decision to, well, that was actually going to be a question, but the decision to speak to people on the front of this crisis. And so, yes, it was a question, I guess, about how deliberate that was, whether that was, did you want to write a book where you spoke to these people as opposed to it being a kind of like potted history of what's happened in housing and, you know, and analysis. How deliberate was that to kind of pursue the sort of journalistic conversational style of the book? And I guess that ties into the question about the language that's used around it, because who gets to talk about housing will dictate how it's actually how it's spoken about in the terms that are used to describe it.
Well, this is something, you know, who makes culture is something you write on so brilliantly and still as much as you can. And I think it's a really important thing to be signposting. Yes, it was a conscious decision to write a book like this. There were so many ways that Tenants could have come into the world, and so many forms it could have taken. And actually, initially, when the book was conceived and there were talks with publishers about it, a lot of them wanted a lot more focus on me and on my story. And I think there are several things to say about that. I think what we call the first person industrial complex in the media today, which kind of implies that if you're not talking about something traumatic that has happened to you, it's not valuable, shocking enough to get clicks. And I really wanted to push back against that. And there is a bit of me and my story in the book where I felt it was relevant. But ultimately, when you're experiencing housing stress in the way that millions of people right now are in the private rented sector, the brutal reality is you're not going to have time or access to resources to write a book. You're probably not being asked to go on TV and talk about it, although of course sometimes that does happen. And when it does, you're not often treated terribly well. We can maybe perhaps talk about some of the examples of that later. And I thought if I was going to do a book on this subject, in the same way that my journalism is, I wanted it to be an intervention of some kind. And the best way to do that seemed to be to give space for other people's voices and their experiences. And everybody in the book, I mean, this is the result of hundreds of interviews over years and years, but ultimately they couldn't all make it in, but they all informed this piece of work. And they let me into their lives so graciously and generously. And they all said the same thing. And it's something I hear over and over again when I'm out reporting on this all over the country, which is, I just want to tell my story so other people don't have to go through this. Now, I'm incredibly unsure about a lot of the arguments I read about journalism as activism. And I certainly don't necessarily subscribe to that idea and wouldn't describe myself that way. But I do think when journalism is at its best, it's speaking truth to power, holding politicians to account. And on this issue, I think we keep hearing 17.5 million people impacted by the housing crisis. But what does that mean? How do you even conceive of those figures? And when you're reading a book, which is a physical product that you hold, hopefully read more slowly than you would scroll through something online. I certainly do. I wanted it to be quite confronting to spend time with these people in the same way that I do, and for their stories to be sort of physically held. And I hope that it is a confronting experience to read Tenants, because the experience for me of going out and speaking to people who are suffering from housing stress, who are being evicted, who are having to choose between paying their rent and paying their bills, who are stuck in the worst kinds of temporary accommodation, like converted office blocks with windows that don't open, lifts that don't work, no living rooms, mums with 3 kids in a 2-room converted office space in on the outskirts of a town, that kind of thing. Like that's very confronting for me, and I hope that I was able to convey that by centering those stories, and I think it's really important to talk about the role of the journalist in that, right? Like the emphasis from a lot of the publishers I initially spoke to on having more of me in the book, and I understand why those kind of memoirs are popular and why banging first-person campaign books that say I think this, I think that, do well, and I understand why it's appealing and easy to digest. But I think the role of the journalist on a social issue like this is to be a conduit for other people's stories, and ultimately I'm going to places that most people don't go week in, week out, and I wanted to be able to take the reader to those places.
Yeah, there was a phenomenon when Peter Rackman was exposed in the 60s where people started reading about what he'd been up to. And the sort of parliamentary reports, lots of people wrote in convinced that they were one of Rackman's tenants, even though by that point he was dead, because it was so familiar. And I think, yeah, the brilliance of what you've done is that people are really going to recognize this and they're going to think, I've got that or worse. You mentioned activism, and do you mind if I just ask you about that quickly? Because there's a really useful part where you sketch out the history of housing activism and rent strikes in the UK, including in St Pancras, which is virtually next to where we virtually are. And you then go on to say, I think quite rightly, that you were worried about the badly thought through calls for rent strikes during the pandemic. And I wondered if you could say a bit more about your worries about that and maybe what you'd have liked to see from the housing movement instead, or in addition to that?
Oh, this is a really, really good question, and my answer may not be entirely popular, but that's okay. I was really, really troubled by the way that housing activism played out online, and I'll be clear by saying there was some really, really good work that was done by grassroots community-led groups, which we can touch on perhaps in a second. But I was really troubled by what I was seeing on Twitter and on Instagram, where there were people I follow or who didn't even follow who were getting retweeted, saying, don't pay your rent strike now at the start of the first lockdown. And the government's response initially was shocking. Like, there are no two ways about that. They were too slow to help private renters who have less savings on average than homeowners, couldn't get mortgage holidays like their landlords or like homeowners. The government was too slow to act. When they did, they didn't do enough. They said they were banning evictions. They didn't ban them. They just suspended them. They increased the local housing allowance, which for anyone who doesn't know is the mechanism through which housing benefit is calculated and delivered through universal credit. They raised it to cover the lowest third of market rents in any given area, but prior to austerity, it had covered the lowest half. So it was an increase, but it still wasn't getting it back to where it used to be. And this was during one of the biggest economic crises in living memory, certainly since 2008. And we didn't know what was going to happen. And I think the response for private renters was paltry at best. All that being said, You can criticize the government, but calling for people to stop paying their rent, it just struck me that if you were calling for that, you either came from wealth or didn't fear the repercussions of not paying your rent, which are eventually being evicted as things stand right now, or getting, and even you could, this, both of these things could happen to you, getting a county court judgment against you, which will be on your credit record for years and prevent you being able to rent anywhere in the future, and also stop you getting support from your local authority. So when I was seeing this pop off on Twitter and on Instagram, I was like, as things exist right now, like rent strikes in this country have historically been incredibly powerful. I think one of the ones I talk about in the book, aside from St. Pancras, is Mary Barber during the First World War, who led a rent strike in Glasgow when landlords were trying to profit from the First World War by putting rents up, which is so wild. But she succeeded. She took on landlords. They were resisting bailiffs, and actually that's one of the reasons why we ended up with rent control in this country, was that rent strike. So they used to be so powerful. But as things stand right now, with Section 21 that didn't exist when Mary Barber was leading a rent strike, and with CCJs, county court judgments, telling someone on a low income to stop paying their rent willingly is putting them at so much risk. And it just struck me that anyone who was calling for it either had parents they could move in with, or enough money to not have to worry about what would happen if they got a CCJ, couldn't get homelessness support, and I don't know, couldn't rent anywhere else, couldn't get social housing because the social housing waiting list is so long. It just seemed incredibly reckless to me and incredibly ill thought through. That doesn't mean that I think that the status quo is working, is fair, is right. It's absolutely not. But I think it would have been far more heartening to see a response that actually supported people. And there were local groups who were doing that, who were raising money for people at a local level if they were struggling. People at a local level going around explaining, what rights renters did have. There were eviction resistances taking place even during lockdowns, socially distanced ones. I reported on one which was unsuccessful in Brighton, which features in the book. And I think, as housing activism goes, that was probably more useful. But what I still have taken away actually from how easily those tweets or Instagrams are being fired off saying, rent strike now, stop paying your rent, was actually how poorly understood renting is, and how often the people who have platforms, so some of the people I'm talking about have got like tens of thousands of followers, have potentially never been on a low income, never been in poverty, and never been incredibly worried about losing their home.
I was going to say, actually, that kind of brings back to what we were just talking about as well, in that, and that this is like a question about your experiences in speaking to so many people on the front line of the housing emergency, as we're going to call it, is that housing rights and the politics around housing would seem to the uninitiated so impenetrable and so complex that they would require a huge amount of time and a huge undertaking to kind of get to grips with. And I was just wondering, is there, amongst people that you interview, did you encounter people that had an appetite to know more about it, but just felt as though it was beyond the threshold of what they're capable to do, given all of the other kind of burdens and constraints that exist on their lives? And how do we solve that? How do we solve the fact that the people who could benefit the most from knowing their rights around housing or whatever are also probably the most time poor and unable to kind of join those groups that are going to kind of share that information freely and organise events and organise people to stand up for their rights and to fight for better housing conditions?
Well, I think this is so important, because so many private renters do not know what rights they have. But something that I have learned by speaking to people who are being evicted or in rent arrears experiencing housing stress or who are homeless is once you need to know your rights, you learn them pretty fast. Once you're in the system, you realize what a mess that system is very quickly. And everybody who appears in this book knows it inside out. They will start quoting legislation at you, you know, and often that's because they've been getting help from, unfortunately, charities who are doing the brunt of this work. And maybe we can talk a bit about that. Like Shelter, like Crisis, like Centrepoint. And yeah, once you're in the system, you get to know it. And Limarra, whose story is told early on in the book, she knows more about housing law than most people I speak to. And she now, when I talked to her about her story, because I read through each chapter with everybody who featured in it to make sure they were happy with how they'd been presented, etc. And she was like, yeah, and now I know that when they did this, they shouldn't have done that, and they should have done this, because she has got to know the system so well through experiencing it. But until it happens to you, you don't know. You don't know what a section, most people I think don't know what a section 21 is until they are served with one, don't know what a section 8 is. And getting to know the system, the legislation, the process, when you are facing losing your home is so stressful and it's so dehumanizing. And it, in its own way, aside from the trauma of an eviction in and of itself, takes a huge, huge toll on a person. I mean, I specialize in housing for work, I have to know this stuff, and I still find myself, I'd be interested to know what Nick thinks about this, because this is very much his wheelhouse, but I still find myself being like, no, that can't be right. Oh yeah, you can make yourself intentionally homeless by waiting to be evicted rather than finding somewhere to move into. And it's really, really complicated, and it's almost impossible to navigate. And I suppose that brings us to like the second part of the question, which is how do we make sure people know their rights, and how do we make sure people can get support? I think there are several things we could do. And again, I'd be so interested to know Nick's thoughts on this. Streamlining housing would be really helpful. There's so many bits of legislation, they all impact people differently. And there is a piece of legislation coming very soon, which should bolster renters' rights, potentially end Section 21. Let's see what happens. Word on the street being Westminster, is that it might come next week, which will be really, really huge. But what it looks like, yeah, I don't know, but we're hoping it will end Section 21. But even if it does, I think this impenetrable, multifaceted labyrinth of bits of legislation, things you can do wrong, will still persist, and that's really, really, really hard to navigate. And what I'm really troubled by is a lot of the work now being done by charities or grassroots organizations to support people and help them understand their rights once used to be supported by legal aid. We had state funding for access to this kind of support, and it's been replaced by charity and by community groups. I don't think that is a good thing. I don't think we should forget what legal aid cuts mean for people. And actually, we now have housing law deserts in Britain, where once you'd be able to get hold of a housing solicitor who could help you through legal aid. Now there are whole areas of the country where you have no access to that because of the cuts to legal aid.
Yeah, when I was thinking about the questions this morning, I was going to say that there's sort of two forms of help that are available. There's sort of professional help, which would include both legal aid lawyers and the charity sector. And then there's activist groups, grassroots groups, mutual aid groups. But the government seems to have sort of either invented or at least bolstered a third one today, which is the regulator, and the idea that social housing tenants will be fine because they can rely on a regulator who's going to step in, a bit like Ofsted. We've talked a bit about the limits of grassroots groups, but I just wondered if you wanted to talk a bit about the benefits and limitations of each. And I'm particularly interested to hear what you think about the idea that the state's going to step in and plug the gap where, particularly legal aid disrepair is missing, and make sure that social landlords behave themselves.
Oh, look, I don't want to downplay what a momentous day today was for social housing tenants. And for anyone who doesn't know what we're talking about on this call, which is totally possible, it was a huge day that has been years in the making. The Social Housing Regulation Bill was finally published. We know what it includes, and it has given the social housing regulator, which already existed, new powers. And those will include being able to do Ofsted style inspections with just 48 hours notice. They used to have to give a social landlord, I think it was 28 days notice. And they've lowered the bar for intervention, which used to be quite high. So basically it will be easier for the regulator to get involved when a housing association or local authority is behaving badly, not doing repairs, not responding properly to their tenants. And this is vital. Like, I've been in homes just this year, right? That's just so far this year. A disabled man living in a housing association flat, covered in mold, every surface covered in mold. The mold was attacking his kitchen cabinets. There were slugs in his kitchen. He could not be living there, but they wouldn't rehome him, and they were not carrying out repairs properly. That is what social housing providers have been getting away with. Now that is, and I visited an estate where everyone had lung infections because there was damp mold everywhere. These people are all paying, not that this should excuse a provider not doing repairs, whether you're paying your rent or not, right? But all of these people were paying their rent to their social landlord, and it was not the case that they were being treated like human beings. And particularly that gentleman, Mr. Etienne Cromer, has really, really stuck with me, because after just an hour with him, me and my colleague Albert, who is the iPaper's video editor, were coughing outside for 10 minutes. That guy has to live there. So this bill is so vital. The regulator is going to have more powers than it's ever had. The state is apparently taking control of social housing and going to keep social housing providers accountable. But I've spoken with a few people, expert housing solicitors, barristers, and they've all said the same thing to me, which is we are seeing more and more and more social housing condition complaints. How is this regulator going to keep up? How is it going to be everywhere? We can't keep up. How is it going to work? And they've also the same thing, which is we don't really think they're prepared for how many complaints they're going to get. So I think it's really important to acknowledge that, because actually I think this is huge, and the number of social tenants living in dire conditions is too high. But it's a step in the right direction. It was initially promised in 2018, post Grenfell. It shouldn't have taken this long for anything to happen. It's really good that it has. And actually, with this government, this Conservative government that we've got, I can't stress enough what a huge change in direction it is for them to be really putting this front and center. It would have been unthinkable a couple of years ago, the fact that this kept getting kicked into the long grass. After Grenfell, one of the biggest avoidable tragedies, I hate it when people call it a tragedy, because that implies, again, like crisis. Oh, tragic. What could we have done? No, there's so much that could have been done. People were crying out to avoid a disaster in the building they lived in. Grenfell was avoidable. But after that, social tenants were supposed to be getting a voice, and they are finally getting it. And one of the things as well that the bill is going to bring in is a 250-person panel made up of social tenants who will meet with ministers. I can't remember how often. I want to say every 4 months. I hope that's right. And that again, centering those voices and actually listening to the people who live in social housing is a huge step in the right direction. Is it perfect? No. Has it taken too long? Yes. Will it work? Let's see. This is, where's the money coming from? Who's going to enforce it? How are local authorities who are cash strapped, have been on the receiving end of cuts to public funding now for for over a decade, really? Like, I'm not sure how this is going to work. And we know that with private renting and with evictions too, right? I just wrote a piece about illegal evictions. According to the charity Safer Renting, there were over 7,000 last year. According to the MOJ, I think it was around 12 prosecutions. Illegal evictions are exactly that, illegal, criminal. And if this charity has recorded 7,000, how are there only 12 prosecutions? Well, local authorities don't have the funds and the resources to go around and enforce every illegal eviction, right? And I think we should watch very closely and see what happens with social housing and the conditions in social housing and how this regulator works. But all that being said, I really, really do think this is a huge step forwards, and the stigma of social housing is really real. Like, the reason we don't hear from people living in conditions like Etienne Cromer is because they're embarrassed, they're ashamed. They've watched Benefit Street, they've watched social housing tenants torn apart on programs like Newsnight. They are worried now because social housing is so scarce. They are worried about complaining in case they lose it. And I think in and of itself, the fact that this bill is going through, reminding people that social housing tenants have just as much right to be in their homes as anyone, is a step in the right direction.
Yeah, and just before we move on from this, I was really struck by, on the post-Grenfell politics point, what almost felt like being generous to Theresa May. And you realise that it's not that you were being generous to Theresa May, but by comparison to how much more progressive she was on housing policy than the whole of the New Labour period, it really, really was very striking.
Right. This is something I came up against a lot when she was Prime Minister. Her approach on many issues, not least immigration, incredibly problematic, highly morally, ethically questionable, particularly when you consider how she was pretty good on domestic abuse, but not when it intersected with immigration. It was like she had a real mental block there. The people most likely to be needing domestic abuse support, the same people being locked up in Yarlswood. But that was a complete sort of like can't compute moment for her, both at the Home Office and when she was Prime Minister. And yet, on housing, she just got it more than anyone had for years. And actually, this bill today initially began life when she was Prime Minister. The renting reform, private renting reform, that I hope is being announced next week, though I could do without any more surprise policy announcements. But that also came to life when she was Prime Minister. And she took housing really, really seriously. The letting fee ban, which I was involved in, that happened when she was Prime Minister. And I think as a politician, she just made no sense, because on some issues, she was incredibly progressive, very, very pro-social housing. I guess that's actually quite a big value in some parts of the Tory party, though not all. But then on other issues, she was incredibly right-wing and very, very complex character. But you're completely right, which is to say, you can acknowledge all of this and then say, well, how is it that a Conservative PM did more on housing than the entire New Labour period? We've had a Labour government since the 1988 Housing Act came into force, which brought in Section 21 evictions, got rid of rent control, brought us, well, it wasn't actually the 1988 Housing Act that brought us housing associations, but under Margaret Thatcher, we ended up with the model we've now got of sort of semi-privatised social housing, right to buy, one of the biggest acts of privatisation this country has ever seen. All of that came in under Thatcher. We've had a Labour government for a very, very long period of time. Since then, none of that was undone. So I think the fact that Theresa May felt progressive ought to worry us all. But that being said, she did very good work, and I don't want to take away from that. And there were many people, not all of them Conservatives, working in her team who got on board because they saw it as a chance to bring in some of the reform that whatever your politics, was so urgently needed because people are losing their homes right now. People's lives are being ruined right now. And I should stress, you know, a lot of the people on her team who laid the groundwork for the regulation bill that came out today, renters reform, the letting fee ban, the idea that we need to go back to building social housing. They came to work for May because they see, like I see, how desperate people are, and they just wanted to just get it done. Doesn't matter how long she's going to be around. They just wanted to get in there, be on her team and get it done because they saw it as an opportunity. That so often is how things happen in Westminster behind the scenes. There were lots of very, very dedicated people working in Number 10 because they knew she got housing, whether or not they agreed with her on other issues.
I was just going to say as well, I'm wondering to what extent reforms can be made without radical amounts of new housing being built. I mean, this is what I don't quite understand, is that having kind of regulators, having higher standards of inspection carried out, giving people a platform to come and speak to politicians, it all seems lovely. But fundamentally, if the problem is based on a model of scarcity that's fundamental to the economy being in the state that it's in, and for the Tories to continue winning and appealing to homeowners, I don't see what any of these solutions are going to achieve, or they just seem like very topical kind of solutions, when fundamentally, obviously, what has to happen is there needs to be a huge expansion in the number of houses that are built and are available to people, or made available to people in pre-existing buildings. I'm no housing expert, I'm not an economist either, so it's not a question I can necessarily answer, but I just think from maybe even just a layman's perspective, it just looks as though these gestures are just that, and it is just kind of paying lip service to a lot of people's issues with housing rather than ever being able to fundamentally address the problem, which is scarcity. I don't know what you think about that. I'm sorry, I have a chest problem today, so I'm a little bit croaky.
Natalie is with us, even though she's not feeling well, which we're very, very grateful for. So don't you worry about being a bit croaky. Also, I mean, bullseye, what a question. I hope I've made this point in the book, right? This is so urgent for the people that are impacted. They are struggling so much and their lives are being ruined. That's not hyperbole. You get evicted, and you've got no money. You are screwed for years. Your kids are going to feel that trauma. You end up in temporary accommodation indefinitely until you can get a social home. That is years of your life that you've lost. So we do need whatever we can get now. It's that serious. And I think lots of people who work in housing and want reform are really at that point where they're like, whatever it takes to get this through, just get it through, get the letting fee ban through. Doesn't matter if it's 5 years until we get an end of Section 21, just keep banging on the door until we get it. That's the short term. We are sticking plasters on a broken leg. They are topical solutions. You're totally right. Doesn't mean that they're not important. And I think something I find really interesting about a lot of the conversations I read online or pieces I read is they all end with this. It's becoming a bit of a trope, I think, which is well, the problem is capitalism, so end capitalism. Yeah, that's a big part of the problem. But we have to focus on the fact that that's not going to happen anytime soon. Those conversations are vital. The interrogation of the economic model that we have right now is vital. But I hope in Tenants I did that towards the end, whilst also making the point that we need topical solutions right now. And there are several things going on here. Yes, we do need to build more homes, but this is a sort of a refrain of politicians that I think we've all absorbed, where they say, we just need to build more homes, we just need to build more homes, then it will all be all right. It's not just the building homes, it's what homes are we going to build? Are we going to build more homes for private sale that nobody can afford? Well, that's not going to help. Are we going to build more homes for private sale and let people buy them help people buy them through something like Help to Buy? Yeah, okay, that might help some people who can get a deposit together and get a mortgage. Are we going to build more shared ownership homes? Shared ownership is a really, really problematic model in my view. But again, it's the only access to home ownership that some people have. Sure, like, let's do that. But are we going to build more social homes? Are we going to replace the ones that have been lost through right to buy, which as things stand is nearly 2 million since 1980 when the policy was introduced? Bear in mind, the social housing waiting list is around 1 million and has been consistently there in recent years, which, given that the number of people in temporary accommodation keeps rising, shows you that people aren't being moved on, or if they are, they're being moved on very slowly. Well, Michael Gove, the current housing secretary, has said, yes, we need to build social homes, but so far the Treasury have not released huge amounts of money for us to do that. And I think you're quite right that until there is enough truly affordable, secure housing, the only housing tenure that is social housing, there will be this feeling of scarcity. People will keep being pushed into the private rented sector, where, as things stand, landlords can charge whatever they want, really. Rents are rising, they're continuing to reach historic highs outside of London and have been on that trajectory since the pandemic. So if we don't do something, and by do something, I think that is build social housing, this will continue. But you're also quite right and have touched on something really interesting. And I think this poses a huge problem for the left, which is when you have your own home, you are more likely to vote Conservative. Some people think this could be an explanation as to why Labour have struggled in recent years. They've become seen as the party of renters, and homeowners generally vote Conservative because they want to conserve their assets. And I think house price inflation, again, I'm not an economist, just want to be very clear about that. This is quite basic economics. House price inflation is a huge driver of our economy, right? It's a really important contributor to our GDP. Mortgage lending is really, really important to financial services. When house prices, and there's another facet to this, when house prices go up, people feel good. They feel secure. They feel like they're making money, even if they're not. They think, oh, do you know what? I'll take out that loan. I'll take out that credit card. I'll buy that thing because I've got money in the bank because my house is going up in value. So it's good for banks. It's good for getting people into debt. It keeps the wheels of the economy greased. This is on the Bank of England's website. Just like pause on that for a moment. This is on their website. So it's no secret that we need that, which I think is why governments are so keen on measures that inflate house prices, because it's good for the economy and they feel like that is going to keep them getting elected because it has that feel-good factor. And regardless of who you are, how much you've come from, I think it's very, very difficult to expect anyone to not want to make money by doing nothing other than sitting in their house, which is what house price inflation is. So I think that's also one of the big, I'm not immune to this. Do I like the idea of making money and doing nothing? Yeah, sounds great. But there are other ways that we can make sure people have access to wealth, and house price inflation, people seeing houses as assets in this way and not homes, has also contributed to the picture. Building social housing is one, again, quite a short-term fix, but it's long-term too, because we're then making houses national assets again, which we had this huge housing drive in the 20th century, and we did that. We've unraveled that part of the welfare safety net. But I think unless you also tackle house price inflation, or at least encourage a shift in how we think about making money out of housing in the way that we now think about it, because the inflation in recent years has been so wild that people have become millionaires, you know, in the space of like 5 years in some parts of the country. And the appeal of that is really, really, really strong. So I think that was a very long answer. I'm sorry, but there are several things to consider here. And if you're talking about the kind of big picture stuff, house price inflation and how reliant our economy, and not just our economy, the economies in pretty much every country at this point is, then we're not going to see a huge change.
I have to say I'm a bit more optimistic than Vicky about the big picture stuff, because I think Natalie was spot on when you said about homes being made available. That's the key thing. And I agree that it's all gone wrong since the 1980s. But what changed in the 1980s was we didn't knock down all the houses. I mean, they're still there. We can see them out the window. And in fact, there's evidence that there's a growing surplus of homes per capita. The surplus is growing as things have gotten worse. But what's changed is that the legal framework has made homes unaffordable with the deregulation of the private rented sector. And if we change that, which the government is already doing with its promise to abolish Section 21, which I don't think it realises how important it is, then we're well on the way to this aspect of degrowth and making homes less profitable.
That's really interesting. I mean, on that, I suppose there is one thing I didn't mention that does make me quite hopeful, which is in London. The Mayor of London has put aside a right to buy back fund for local authorities who are, I just spoke to someone in Lewisham about this. They are being given money to buy homes back that used to be social homes, have been sold off through right to buy and ended up on the private market. That, if it was rolled out nationally, could be huge. And I should stress also that was a policy in Jeremy Corbyn's manifesto when John Healey was the Shadow Secretary of State for Housing, and he had been in that role for a really long time. And a right to buy back fund was one of their big ideas. And if that could be rolled out across the country, I think you would see a huge shift in who owns the homes that already exist. And of course, that's actually also more environmentally friendly than building new homes. There are so many benefits to doing that, to taking those homes back into public ownership. And you're more optimistic on Section 21 than me, Nick. I'm very worried about the conversations I'm hearing about how that might get watered down or what else might be brought in to appease landlords, but I like your optimism.
Can I just check, sorry, you meant that local authorities would be able to buy back?
And at the moment, that's only in London, but the idea in Corbyn's manifesto was that that would be able to happen nationally. So far, I've only spoken to Lewisham. I asked them how it was going, and they said that the reception from people selling homes has been incredibly warm, particularly if those people used right to buy their home, their former social home, and were now renting it out and about to sell it. Actually, they were like, no, I'd rather sell it to the council and have it go back into the system, go back to someone else. And that is an incredibly hopeful story. If it's true in other boroughs of London, I'm not sure. I'll try and find out. But of course, right now, only in London.
I was just going to say, sorry, Nick, do you want to add anything?
Go on.
Well, I was just going to mention as well, because you touched upon it briefly when you mentioned Theresa May, and she was talking about her policies on domestic violence and how she was unable to kind of take a sort of holistic / practical view of how it is, connected to almost, what you mentioned, Giles Wood, but I was thinking as well about it as a housing issue. And it isn't just domestic violence, there are countless other issues that once you actually interrogate them, become fundamentally housing issues. And thinking just about, again, I suppose it's that difference between finding kind of like topical solutions to things, also third sector solutions to things. So obviously there are a vast slew of charities that exist to protect women in dangerous situations, as there are lots of housing charities, etc. And you see a lot of this advertising around like, do you need help? Do you need to speak to someone, etc. But actually, when you get to like the crux of it, I mean, fundamentally domestic violence is really a housing problem, because if everybody was able to freely leave the place they were living to go and live somewhere else that was available and affordable for them and their children, then they would. Most victims of domestic violence would. And I think that housing, even before you think about like violence, but like about abuse, housing can be wielded as a kind of a tool of power over somebody. And whether that was something that you encountered, I know that it is, because I've read the book, and there's that statistic at the beginning of the book that struck me and was really shocking, but I've also seen it shared by so many people since as well, about women's average earnings now not meeting the threshold of being able to rent a 1-bedroom flat almost anywhere in the country, I think it was. So yeah, I was just curious to know if that had come up in your discussions, and what people's experiences were on the issue of kind of like domestic abuse and housing. It's an issue that's close to my heart and something that I've written about a fair amount.
Yeah, and you've written on it so eloquently. I would encourage anyone who's here to check out some of Natalie's writing in this area. It was for the White Review, right?
I did write a piece of White Review, yeah.
Well, it's very good and really important. Yes, so many social ills, when you break them down, come back to access to housing and who does and doesn't have a stable and secure home. I'll get to domestic abuse in just a second, but I think housing as an intersectional problem is really, really important. Black people are more likely to experience homelessness, so housing is a race issue. LGBTQ plus people are more likely to experience homelessness, so housing is a gender and sexuality issue. Women right now, according to the Women's Budget Group, who are single, not looking to get housing with a partner, will not find a home they can afford on average. And of course, averages are problematic, but for the purposes of this, like let's talk about this analysis. They will not find a home they can afford to rent or to buy anywhere in the country, anywhere. So if you are leaving an abusive relationship, or you want to, or you need to, that's going to be really hard. And there's a social housing shortage. So if you need to get support from the state, you're going to be pulled into the system. You're going to end up in temporary accommodation. You might end up in really terrible privately rented accommodation that you're trying to pay for with universal credit housing benefit calculated by the LHA that we spoke about earlier, that only covers the lowest third of market rents in any given area. So it is not possible to leave a domestic abuse situation easily. And a lot of sector experts that I speak to say that housing is a huge barrier and a huge reason why a lot of people who are experiencing domestic abuse do not leave. You're quite right there. And let's bring that back to Theresa May for a moment. The introduction of right to rent immigration checks, right, also mean that if you are worried about your immigration status, you're in shaky territory, the Home Office have been asking questions, trying to get at you about your right to remain. This happens all the time. As a journalist I know who has been working for the BBC, who's lived here her whole life, has just been told that she can't stay. She's appealing it at the moment. She's never lived anywhere else. Like, this happens all the time. If you fear a right to rent check, you won't be able to leave an abusive partner. That's another intersection of this. That's, a direct result of a Home Office policy. So I think if we want, let's talk about women or anyone, people in domestic abuse situations, because it's not just women, not just cis women. Access to housing is a huge, huge barrier to safety, huge. Some steps have been taken in recent years to make sure that local authorities have the highest possible duty to help domestic abuse victims and survivors, which Nick will know lots about, but it's still not enough, because having a duty to help people is all very well and good, but if there's nowhere for them to go, then what?
Yeah, just a reminder to please do post any questions in the Q&A, which we'll come onto in a couple of minutes. Before we do, I just wanted to challenge you, Vicky, if that's okay, on attitudes to landlords, because quite early on, you point out how the tenants you're speaking to are diminishing their own wealth and shifting it into the pockets of landlords. And then a few pages later, which I think this audience might find quite provocative, you warn against creating bogeymen out of property professionals, because that takes the heat off the state and the people who are really in charge. And I think a lot of us would agree that it's important not to be puerile, and we need to think about the structural stuff rather than being moralistic. But do you think there's a benefit in reversing narratives about landlords who for decades have been cast as sort of benign daytime property show type people, and say, actually, these guys are really, really bad?
Good question, and I love to be challenged. It's good to have disagreement. I will level with you as to why that is the approach I took with this book. And it's quite a, well, I'm not going to say cynical actually, because it's not a cynical reason. I wanted it to be reviewed in publications like The Times. I wanted it to reach a mainstream audience who may not have considered some of the ideas in this book. And to them, these ideas will seem incredibly radical. To the people on this call, people who buy books in Housemans, they might seem less radical. But I think I wanted Tenants to be a reflection of where politics is right now in Westminster, to get the book on those desks. And I wanted it to speak to people who maybe aren't as far along in their journey in terms of questioning these structures. And I wanted it to change some minds. And that was a difficult line to tread, because you cannot speak to everyone, and you cannot write a book on an issue like this that won't alienate some people. And to be frank, that was the reason for saying, let's not focus on landlords here. I think ultimately in this book, and I'll be very clear, I think the behavior of so many landlords is morally repugnant. I think the ethics of landlording, rentier capitalism in the form that we have it in right now need to be questioned and need to be challenged. But as I was writing this book, thinking about what kind of intervention might actually bring about some change right now, that was something I came up against. It's a mainstream book for a mainstream audience. And I hoped that I might get into the hands of some people who maybe haven't questioned their position in these structures before, or haven't questioned how they vote. And that was the reason for focusing on the state and focusing on politicians.
You're among friends now, and you can say what you really think, which is nice. Natalie, did you have other questions before we come on to the Q&A? You're on mute, so. Sorry, you're still on mute there.
Sorry, I muted myself because I kept having coughing fits. No, I covered all of my questions. And I think that that's a very, I admire the stance that you've taken in writing the book for that reason. And I think that it's something that I wish more writers would certainly consider, is the sort of the ends and aims of what it is that they're writing. And I think there's place for everything. I think there's a place obviously for theoretical texts that are just, there to elucidate. But I do also think that there is just as much need for work such as yours that want to lead to real change. And I'm hoping that it does. And in fact, I'm certain that it will. But yes, I just want to congratulate you on writing such an important book, and for finally getting it out into the world, because I know it's been a huge amount of work and it's taken a very long time to write. So congratulations.
Thank you. And for what it's worth, I think there's space for all of these conversations. And also, this is just one book that I've written. Who knows what will come next? I think different kinds of texts can serve different purposes, right? And to use the stories of the people who let me into their lives for Tenants to further a particular agenda that I might have that may or may not ever come to fruition, didn't feel right. But actually to use it to drive change that's possible right now within the system that we've got within the next few years felt like the right thing to do. But I think you're completely right, and I think there's space for theory here. There's space for people to take a very, very strong stance. There's space for cultural criticism. There's no one way to approach this, and I'm open to questions and debate on it for that reason.
Great. There's go on, sorry.
Oh no, I was just wondering if we received any questions.
We've got one here from Andrew. What is the panel's view on tenants unions like Living Rent Scotland and Manchester Tenants Union? And we have our own home locally grown examples as well.
I think tenants unions are increasingly vital they are helping people access support that, for all the reasons we discussed during this talk, is not as available as it used to be or should be. And I think that they provide spaces for people to come together, to connect, to support one another, not always even in terms of having access to people with legal knowledge or even financial support. But actually, if you're going through an eviction, that's a really lonely, isolating, terrifying experience. And there's one guy in the book, he's not the only person who is an example of this, sadly. He's called Tony, he's an older guy, lives in Colchester, and through joining his local union, Colchester Renters, he's made friends, you know, as a pensioner experiencing housing stress, people who have supported him through really, really, really hard times. So I think that community that is so often hard to come by actually is really fostered in tenants unions. But I'd come back to what we were saying earlier, which is I'm nervous about the role that people are taking on in their spare time to provide housing support, to provide legal advice, the labour that they are doing that is unpaid. I'm nervous about that. I'm nervous about celebrating it when it's a direct result of cuts to public funding and services.
Yeah, go on, Natalie, sorry.
Please, Nick, you go.
Thanks. We were talking about this the other day, Vicky, that there's this contradiction because as a lawyer, you know that having a lawyer can be extremely demeaning and transactional and effectively takes away your right to argue your own case. You hand it on to someone else, and there's something deeply unradical about engaging the services of a lawyer, even a state-funded lawyer. At the same time, there are difficulties you mentioned with renters unions. It's unsustainable for communities to provide their own support over and over and over again. And it's something I think about a lot. And I'd remembered the other day that there was a very short-lived but successful project in Germany at the very end of the 19th century where the trade union movement funded membership model unions where the workers would all be elected by the members, and the transactionality was sort of disguised by the fact that the workers had to be members who had to be elected, but they were highly skilled at following the law and representing people. And I think encouragingly the renters movement that we're seeing is drifting towards that sort of formality and is very conscious of not having a transactional aspect to its work. So I think I'm not going to criticize the movement, and it's working very, very hard to get rid of the difficulties that it has.
Yeah, very thoughtful.
Living Rent in Scotland seem to get some huge wins, and they've made a lot of people's lives a lot easier. And I know a lot of people who've been able to challenge evictions and rent increases as a result of the help and advice that they've given them. So I do actually think they're a wonderful and very effective organisation. I think they're operating in a slightly different political environment, which is slightly more progressive and amenable to people and tenants' rights. And I don't know whether they would have quite so much success if they weren't in Scotland. But yes, I mean, I just broadly agree with the two of you, but just wanted to also add that I know lots of stories of people whose lives have been improved considerably through the efforts that organisations like Living Rent have made, and that's no more small thing. It's pretty admirable.
And also, you know, like I think this point about being radical and not encouraging people to necessarily follow rules that, let's face it, shouldn't exist, right? Like, people are evicted for such bogus reasons, so why encourage people to follow the rules that are so bogus? And actually, tenants unions, renters unions can do radical things like picket letting agents who are behaving badly. I think the symbolism of that when it does happen is really powerful. So two things can be true at once. I know that's like not popular these days, right? Like, tenants unions are good. It would be great if they didn't need to exist. If we weren't in an emergency, who knows what their role would be? And I think it's an important question to be asking.
It's also interesting that they're considered kind of like radical actions when really these are some of like the most ancient modes of resistance. You know, right. People have been doing them for centuries, and they weren't. I mean, I don't know, I wasn't there, but I don't think in the 19th century that these kind of modes of resistance were even considered to be that, you know, radical. Even in the 1970s, they weren't considered particularly radical acts. So there's a kind of deep questioning there of what's happened in terms of what we're told in terms of what constitutes radical action now.
Exactly. And I think there's something, forgive me for being a little sentimental about this, but I do think something we really need to talk about more is who is able to protest, who is able to risk their own safety and security to challenge the state, to challenge the laws that exist, to challenge an eviction. And something that I've seen play out with renters unions is actually people who do have housing security, homeowners sometimes, people who earn more money than the person being evicted, for instance, showing up to an eviction resistance, because for them, getting arrested or getting into trouble wouldn't be so devastating. And that kind of solidarity is really powerful, and that's happening, all the time. The story of Anthony in the book is an example of that. A lot of the people I spoke to, people who were at his eviction resistance, and some of them had secure housing, and they were doing something that someone who doesn't have secure housing can do, right? Which is like take the time out of their day just to be there and liaise with the police. And it'd be great if that didn't have to happen, but where we are right now, it does.
Yeah, and I think it's worth saying that lawyers and activists and campaigners can work together, work very effectively as well. And I don't know if you saw the case against Southwark a couple of weeks ago, where Southwark were trying to blame people for living in housing that was too small for their families, even though it was all they could afford. So that were defeated, and that came out of Housing Action Southwark and Lambeth's campaign, linking up with lawyers. I've got a couple more questions, one about Labour and one about the Conservatives for balance. Dan says, thanks for the talk. Can't wait for the book. That's great. Do you hold out much hope for Labour under Starmer to affect these kind of necessary changes, or do you think people's energies are best spent working locally on community-based projects?
What a question. Top points, saving that to the end. Well done. What will I say on Keir Starmer? Bearing in mind, I work for a national newspaper. I will say that I couldn't tell you what Labour are doing on housing right now, and I'm a housing correspondent. That's what I'll say. I'd love to know where they're at. I'd love them to get in touch. I'd love them to come back to me. I don't know. Like under the previous shadow housing minister or the one before, it keeps changing. I was hearing from them quite a lot. I thought they were doing some interesting things, perhaps not going as far as John Healey did under Corbyn. But I couldn't tell you what they're up to. So that, I hope, is a way of answering your question. And do I think people's energies are best spent working locally on community-based projects? The answer to this is twofold, right? Whether you like it or not right now, legislation happens in Westminster and it's made by and large by the government, although of course private members' bills from members of other parties do. And Karen Buck, a Labour MP, is a really good example of this in housing. Her Homes Fitness for Human Habitation bill did become policy. So it can work that ideas come from Labour and then become Conservative policy. The letting fee ban, now the Tenant Fees Act 2019 was a Lib Dem private members bill. The Renters Reform Bill also started life off as, I believe, in Lib Dem private members bill. So there is stuff that happens in Westminster that isn't always just from the government. I think we have to do two things. I think everyone has to do two things if they want to be engaged, and that's think about who you vote for, because what they do will impact everyone in the country. Where they stand on housing will. But as we've just discussed with tenants unions, they're doing really, really vital work. So I think two things can be true and two things can be necessary. But I'm interested to hear what you guys think.
I think it depends a lot on where you are. There are some like a lot of housing stuff is local stuff, and there are some appalling local authorities who are investing in their own companies to build housing for private sale. And there are some great councils doing really good things. So it depends a lot on where you are.
Diplomatic. I mean, if the question was about, I mean, I have quite a withering assessment of Keir Starmer and his Labour Party, and I think that housing policy is really the kind of litmus test barometer, whichever kind of analogy you want to use for like the politics of that party and what they stand for. And the vagueness on housing, I think, speaks to just a wider issue of them being reluctant to kind of put any kind of stakes in the ground whatsoever, in the name of, I don't know, trying to appeal to the widest spectrum of people to the last possible moment. I don't really know. I don't know what the strategy is. So in terms of Keir Starmer and Labour Party, I don't hold out much hope. And I certainly don't think that they've displayed the kind of determination or kind of like leadership that a housing crisis of this scale would require. It is going to take somebody quite brave and quite determined, I think, to solve any of those issues, or to kind of, like we say, maybe burst that housing property bubble, which is what obviously the housing crisis is going to take to an extent. So no, and yes, since 2019, I have been primarily focused on more local and grassroots initiatives for my own sanity more than anything.
Home is what we're talking about here, right? We're talking about home, having a home, somewhere you can go to sleep, wake up every day, be at your most vulnerable and be safe. The fact that we cannot give people access, millions of people, 70.5 million people in this country are struggling, and according to Shelter, being subjected to the housing emergency. That's a huge number. And if we can't give those people a home, we are talking about housing, of course, but like this language is important too. We're talking about homes. We're talking about somewhere that you know you're going to be all right. You need access to housing, like you need access to water and food. The fact that our politicians are not grasping that and fixing it is something we should all be incredibly worried about. The fact that this isn't the biggest policy area and that everything isn't joined up, because this sits across the DWP and the Treasury as well. The fact that it's sort of like, oh, Department for Levelling Up, maybe we'll call it the Department for Housing, Department for Levelling Up, Department for Housing, whatever. Oh, just, it's kind of a sideshow, doesn't matter. That should really, really worry us all, because we are talking about the most fundamental thing a human being needs to exist, to survive. I'd love to hear from Labour. I'll give them another email next week.
I think it's fascinating that you don't know what their policy is. I think that speaks volumes about, I think it's Lisa Nandy is the current secretary, but I'm not sure. I
think it might have changed again. I must confess, I am on annual leave at the moment, but I got a message a couple of days ago that I need to read. I believe I'm speaking with someone who is not Lisa Nandy. So I think
okay, well, I'm sure you'll give that message the urgent attention it deserves. We've got one more question from Sophie, and I'll ask a follow-up if that's okay. And it's about Theresa May. What you said about Theresa May doing right by housing, but having questionable policies on immigration, etc. Do you think that the good interventions on housing comes at the cost of something else? And I'm going to ask a follow-up, which, if that's okay, which is, do you think Theresa May was actually good on housing, or do you think she was just less lamentably terrible than everyone else we've seen?
Oh, all right. I thought the last question was a good one to end on, but this is, yeah, top points for this one. You can both have equally good feedback for your questions. Do I think that good housing policies have to come at the expense of something else? No, I don't. I don't think they should. I don't think that at all. Will they come at the expense of other things? Well, maybe. Let's see. But should they? No, I see no reason why we can't build affordable, good quality social housing. I see no reason why what's going on in London to bring homes, social homes, council homes sold off through right to buy back into public ownership couldn't happen. I see no reason why we can't have more renters' rights. I see no reason why all of those things can't happen and nothing else bad happen. I see no reason, politically, in terms of policy, practically, legally. I see no reason. What was your follow-up, Nick? Remind me.
Was Theresa May good or not?
As I understand it from lots of people who were in the office, near her office, where her burning social injustices speech, by all accounts, was taped to the wall, and she would keep coming back to it and say, this is what we stand for. this is what we stand for, this is what we believe. She was good on housing. She genuinely got it. She really cared about it. Is you know, what the people who were there have told me when I've interviewed them. Now, something else I heard when she was Prime Minister was that she was even warming up to rent control if it was called rent regulation. That's what I've heard from a very reliable source who I've interviewed. For a Conservative at that point in time, at this point in time, unthinkable. This government, Michael Gove is talking a good game on many housing issues, or rent control, rent regulation, not one of them. So if that is true, I have no reason to believe that it's not true, then yeah, that was pretty progressive from her. I don't think she was around long enough, frankly, to make a proper assessment of what was lip service, what was actually going to happen. But in the very, very short time that she was Prime Minister, actually a huge shift took place. Was that her? Was that the very, very talented and knowledgeable people that she put in that office with the speech taped to the wall, who came from all sorts of places and knew what to do to sort out housing? It was, you know, she took their advice, she sought their counsel. Does that mean that she would have gone the whole way? Well, we'll never know, will we? And does that mean that it was, you know, not problematic, and that some of her other policies weren't morally egregious? Absolutely not.
Yeah, it's a provocative question, and the reason I was pushing it is because it's not as daft as it sounds when we think about stuff like Keith Joseph probably built more council housing than any person dead or alive. Like, it's not necessarily anathema to Tories to be good on housing. Theresa May didn't do anything, but maybe she talked a game, and maybe that's the important point.
Well, let's be fair to her. She got white papers and green papers and bills in progress. The social housing regulation bill today began life with her, and renters' rights also did. Actually, she did get those bits of legislation in, you know, in the system, and that at that time that was major. But I think you're making a very interesting point there. Like, it's not anathema to Tories to be good on housing, to be pro-social housing, and she is a big C Conservative who believed in social housing. And I think this is something that Labour, that the left, are going to have to consider. Actually, if the Conservatives got good on housing, which Michael Gove is really, really going for it over there at Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities, worst department name of all time, poses a big electoral problem. But I mean, is it the right thing for some of these reforms to be implemented? Absolutely. I think we forget that there are lots of different factions within the Conservative Party, and actually social housing is very important to a lot of them. But as we've seen this week, and I think this is probably quite a good place to end on, because we haven't actually talked about it, is Boris Johnson about to be evicted from Number 10 for the absolutely disgraceful stuff in the Sue Gray report. You know, like, whatever you think about the pandemic, reading that and reading that cleaning staff were abused, that security staff were treated badly, key workers keeping those working for the government safe while they tried to run the country in a pandemic, that to me was class wealth masterclass in Britain. Like, that's all you need to know. That's class and wealth right now in a nutshell. Hideous. So yeah, he was about to be evicted from Downing Street by the 1922 committee, because the Tories love a bit of regicide. But to save himself, what did he do? Oh, we're going to extend right to buy to housing association tenants. We've got a social housing shortage. His own Secretary of State for Housing is talking about that, saying we need to build more. To save his skin, he played to that bit of the Tory party who genuinely think, as per Thatcher, right to buy creates Conservative voters. That will save us. That will keep us in the job. That will keep us getting elected. Conservatives love regicide. They also love being in power. That's what they want. I think we should really remember why he made that announcement this week, which is completely impractical and actually very, very complex and not necessarily good for anyone. You know, housing is inherently political, and home ownership is seen as a way, increasing home ownership is seen as a way of winning votes. And I think it was Osborne who's supposed to have famously said, oh, well, council housing just creates Labour voters. You know, these are the conversations being had when it comes to housing policy. Once again, what we're talking about here is people having safe, secure, stable homes, and it is kicked around like a political football. And I think it's interesting that Johnson, wanting to save himself this week, fell back on right to buy, just hoping to evoke Thatcher and stay in the job.
Natalie, is there anything you want to add before we wind up? You're on mute still.
I was just going to say that as much as I loathe and detest Margaret Thatcher, at least that was a politician who had a kind of a strategy and an idea and an ideology, which I don't think the current Tory party leadership has. And so, yeah, while it's exceptionally galling to have somebody who is so kind of like morally, ethically, but also kind of like just ideologically barren at the helm of the country, that in itself is arguably like more disconcerting than someone whose politics I like you know, vehemently oppose and detest, is just this total opportunist who is out to extend his own power. So hopefully the hubris will eventually catch up with him, and there'll be some shift in the tide. I don't know.
Yeah, you know, it's bad when they're recycling old ideas. Doesn't have a new one.
Yeah. Vicky, any closing words from you? Anything you haven't mentioned?
Just thank you guys so much for such brilliant questions and such a thoughtful conversation. Thank you for engaging with the book, and thank you to anyone and everyone who came. And I would love to know what you all think about the book. And I'm open to being challenged, and I'm open to disagreement. I think that's important.
Great. Yeah, well, it's been really fun. Thanks so much for all of your time, and honestly do buy the book. It's critical to understanding, as Vicky says, the most important thing that's going on at the moment. And apart from that, thanks very much, everyone, and have a lovely evening, and hopefully see you at some other events soon. Sorry, go on. And
buy Nick and Natalie's books. I would also say they are equally vital to understanding class and wealth in Britain today. Natalie's first book, Steal As Much As You Can. Her second short book, Class, for Tate, which is really talks about right to buy a bit in there as well, if you, need a housing way in. And obviously you've got another book coming out, and Nick, yours, I know you're writing it at the moment, all strength to your typing fingers, but I can't wait to read yours. So that's my final.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks very much. Great. Take care, everyone. Have a lovely evening.
Lovely evening.
Bye.
Bye.